hier in unserer Zoom-Veranstaltung. Ich hoffe, dass man mich gut hören kann. Und ich werde jetzt ganz kurz Ruth, unserer Mitveranstalterin von der Deutsch-Israelischen Gesellschaft, dann auch ganz kurz noch das Wort geben, dass sie auch noch ganz kurz auch für die GIG begrüßt. Ich möchte Omri Boehm ganz herzlich begrüßen. Im Moment ist er in Berlin. Er lehrt eigentlich in New York an der New School. Geboren ist Omri Boehm in Israel, im Galil, ist Philosoph, ein Beruf, der eigentlich doch immer wieder zu Ehren kommt, gerade dann, wenn sich zeigt, dass man gerade aus dieser Perspektive über politische Realitäten sich unabhängiger Gedanken machen kann, als das manchmal bei den sogenannten Politologen und Experten der Politik der Fall sein mag. Omri Boehm hat über Kants Kritik an Spinoza ein Buch geschrieben, über das Isaacsopfer als religiösem Modell des Ungehorsams geschrieben, also sich bisher sozusagen eher mit ganz grundsätzlichen Fragen auch der Religionskritik und der Philosophie beschäftigt. Sein neues Buch, das auf Deutsch vor wenigen Monaten erschienen ist, Israel, eine Utopie, und im nächsten Jahr auch auf Englisch erscheinen wird unter dem Titel A Future for Israel Beyond the Two-State Solution, hat schon vielfältige Diskussionen ausgelöst. Omri, du entwirfst darin tatsächlich eine andere zionistische Utopie für Israel, eine liberale zionistische Utopie, die aber natürlich auch mit vielen Tabus der Diskussion bricht, die uns im Moment sozusagen immer wieder begegnen. So viel von meiner Seite erstmal, und Ruth, vielleicht sagst du auch noch mal kurz als Mitveranstalterin ein paar Worte, bevor ich dann dein Mikrofon erstmal schließe, weil das für die Akustik besser ist, und ich sage dann auch noch kurz etwas, wie wir die ganze Diskussion dann führen können. Aber Ruth, vielleicht möchtest du auch noch guten Tag sagen.
Ja, vielen Dank. Lieber Hanno, erstmal danke, dass du das alles organisierst, technisch. Da wäre ich etwas überfordert und du kannst es schon sehr gut. Und lieber Omri Boehm, herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag. Wir haben vorher schon kurz besprochen, dass es auch eine Chance ist, um viel mehr Leute zu erreichen, als bei einem Abend, 2. Dezember, kalt in Konstanz. Und wir sind sehr gespannt, was Sie uns erzählen. Vielen Dank.
Ja, ich möchte nur noch ganz kurz sagen, wie der Abend ablaufen wird. Omri wird seinen Vortrag großteils in seinem wunderbar klaren Englisch halten. Er fühlt sich da in der Sprache doch einfach wohler. Aber die Diskussion werden wir auf Deutsch machen können mit ihm. Und vielleicht wird er auch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch am Anfang zu uns sagen. Aber wie gesagt, er fühlt sich jetzt, was den Vortrag angeht, auf Englisch einfach sicherer. Aber ich denke, das werden wir alles gut verstehen können. Danach werde ich vielleicht noch die eine oder andere kurze Nachfrage an ihn haben, aber dann eigentlich auch gleich euch allen das Wort geben. Das machen wir einfach, damit es vernünftig ablaufen kann, entweder über den Chat oder über die F&A, also Fragen- und Antworten-Funktion. Das geht folgendermaßen: Für alle, die damit noch nicht so ganz vertraut sind: Wenn ihr mit dem Cursor auf dem Bildschirm nach unten fahrt, geht ein Menü auf, falls es nicht eh schon offen ist. Ziemlich in der Mitte gibt es unten die Funktion Chat. Wenn man die öffnet, kann man an alle oder an die Diskussionsteilnehmer eine Nachricht schicken, die leider höre ich gleichzeitig mehrere Stimmen. Das wundert mich jetzt sehr, wenn das noch mehrere tun.
Also das Einzige, was es kann sein, dass Sie mich hören.
Aber du sagst ja nichts. Also ich hoffe, dass das jetzt ein Problem ist, das sich nicht weiter ständig wiederholt. Aber ich glaube, es gibt da nicht mehr Probleme. Auf jeden Fall mit dem Chat können Sie, ja, ich höre auch jetzt von anderen, es klappt gut. In den Chat können Sie Fragen stellen oder auch Beiträge einfach auch so posten. Also es gibt sozusagen die Möglichkeit, einfach Kommentare da reinzuschreiben. Über die F&A-Funktion, das haben einige von Ihnen, von euch schon gemacht, kann man wirklich Fragen stellen an Omri Boehm und ich werde schauen, dass die auch beantwortet werden. Jetzt muss ich nur noch gucken, dass ich Ruth, dass ich dich finde und wieder auf Stumm schalte, weil das könnte auch ab und zu mal eine doppelte Stimme auslösen, ein doppeltes Geräusch. Aber jedenfalls, Omri, dir gehört jetzt das Wort. Bitte leg los.
Ja, erstmal vielen Dank für die Einladung und die Einführung. Ich werde doch, wie versprochen, ein paar Wörter auf Deutsch sagen, mehr oder weniger, nur um zu zeigen, dass ich das kann. Das heißt, Hanno und Ruth, um ganz klar zu machen, dass ich gerne Fragen auch auf Deutsch beantworten kann. Ursprünglich habe ich Hanno gesagt, dass ich den ganzen Vortrag oder die ganze Lesung auf Deutsch machen würde. Dann habe ich leider kalte Füße bekommen. Also ich werde das jetzt auf Englisch machen, aber wie gesagt, es geht wirklich auch auf Deutsch. Wir können danach sehr gerne die Fragen stellen und die Diskussion auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch führen. Und ich werde jetzt versuchen, so klar wie möglich Englisch zu sprechen. Also ein paar Wörter jetzt auf Englisch, auch bevor ich einfach vom Buch mehr oder weniger ein bisschen lese. The book, one could say, has 4 chapters. Well, that's not one could say. The book has 4 chapters, but one could say it has 2 parts. One part on memory, the Holocaust and the Nakba, which for me are connected together, at least in the Israeli context. The other on the notion of citizenship, but more specifically even the notion of binational citizenship. And since today I will speak almost exclusively on citizenship and binationalism, there is, I think, no escape from saying a word, or more than just a word, a few words about memory. So just a couple of preliminary remarks on memory, and then I'll move on to read from the book, and I trust that in the so-called Q&A session, we can discuss then both things in both English and German. And to say a few words on memory, I'd like to begin with a quote. So I'm quoting. Quote, "We will have to do in the future 3 things. Expel the large majority of the West Bank's Arabs. Some of them perhaps can be allowed to stay under some conditions, but most of them must go. We will also have to get rid of Arab Israelis from our political system. We have allowed a 5th column to develop, a bunch of first-class traitors. We cannot tolerate their large presence within Israeli politics. Third, we'll have to act completely differently in relation to Iran. Those 3 things would require us to change our war ethics." End quote. We find here, obviously, a rather well-defined political program, and it can be summarized by 3 projected goals. 1, the expulsion of the Palestinians from the West Bank. 2, denaturalization of Arab Israelis. And 3, Iran. But there's another aspect in this quote that's important to notice, especially because it can be easily overlooked, I think. And it is the fact that in order to achieve these 3 goals, Israelis, according to this quote, would have to change their war ethics. Note that part of the quote. Israelis would have to change their war ethics in order to expel the Palestinians and denaturalize Arab Israelis. I take it we will have to abandon our high moral fighting standards and our commitment to democracy and international law, the argument goes. We'll have to achieve a true change of consciousness in order to finally engage in the expulsion of the Palestinians and the denaturalization of Arab Israelis, according to the quote. And for those of you who haven't guessed it yet, I'm sure that quite a few have already, it is coming from Efi Eitam, Brigadier General in Reserve at the IDF, the Israeli military, and currently still Netanyahu's chief candidate to becoming the director of Yad Vashem. So let me ask a question here at the outset, as precisely as I can. What is the relation between Eitam's desire to engage denaturalization and expulsion of Arabs by changing our war ethics and his impending appointment as director of Yad Vashem? It may have been averted, but we still don't know that. That is, what is the relation between these political goals of expulsion and becoming the head of the institution that's entrusted with educating Israeli citizens and soldiers about the Holocaust's past, and the institution that's internationally recognized as the institution that symbolizes the Holocaust's memory? And the answer, I think, is clear enough, and we better say the answer as clear as it is. The idea is to use the Holocaust's memory to achieve Eitam's political goals. That is, employ the Holocaust as a justification of extreme right politics, denaturalization based on race, and war crimes against the Palestinian people. That's worrisome. I hope most people in the audience would agree. It is first and foremost dangerous to the Palestinians, that too need to be said. And it is also dangerous to the continuation of the Holocaust's memory as a politically relevant and politically defensible past. Now, Hanno is one of the initiators of a massive letter of protest against this appointment, the letter that I also signed, along with hundreds of others, asking to save Yad Vashem and its reputation from this horrifying appointment. But despite signing the letter and agreeing very much with its content, I want to begin here by arguing more explicitly, and I'm allowing myself to add, Hanno will be able to correct me, that he does not disagree, that for those of us who have been paying attention, this impending development is not surprising at all. Eitam's appointment wouldn't at all be a break from Yad Vashem's tradition, but rather a culmination of the political use and abuse that this institution has been promoting for years. It is not surprising that we witness this degradation of the Holocaust's memory, since we have all been witnessing the irresponsible and insufficient response, frankly, almost lack of response, among academics, cultural leaders, and public intellectuals because of the alleged sanctity of the Holocaust's memory. Take, for example, one of the top advisors to Yad Vashem and one of the most highly respectable liberal Zionist two-state supporter, very different from Efi Eitam, that is Professor Yehuda Bauer of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Bauer, and again, extremely important authority on the Holocaust history, is on paper in Haaretz, the Israeli daily, defending the view that those who support the right of return, that is, the right of the Palestinians to return to the homes from which they were expelled in Israel's War of Independence, those who support the right of return promote, and this is now a quote, genocidal anti-Semitism. Genocidal anti-Semitism. Not just say Bauer disagrees with them politically. Not just say they're anti-Semitic even. Not just he agrees or he thinks their political jargon is right or wrong, wise or not. No. He draws on his full weight and authority as an expert of Holocaust studies and important Yad Vashem advisor, not at all controversial, unlike Efi Eitam, to claim that because the Jews have the Zionist right to a national home in Israel and return to their biblical homeland from 2,000 years of exile, Palestinians who wish to return to their national home from which they were expelled 70 years ago, promote not a legitimate national aspiration, but a form of Nazism, genocidal anti-Semitism. And that's again from one of the greatest authorities of Holocaust studies and a liberal Zionist, two-state supporter voice. So I want to ask, how far is the logic behind the position of consensual figure like Bauer, who speaks here about the right of return, especially if the two-state solution is over? How far is this position from F.A. Tam's position about expulsion? Logically speaking, how far is it to claim that the wish of Palestinians to exercise the right of return is a form of genocidal anti-Semitism, that is Nazism, from a Tam's claim that we cannot have too many Arabs in Israel, and therefore that they have to be expelled? If a Palestinian who speaks of her national rights is as such a Nazi, what right does she have to be in Israel? And the point is this: for years already, despite what we've all written in the letter, Yad Vashem has been playing irresponsibly with the Holocaust's memory. Here's another example. Its chief private donor is Sheldon Adelson, Trump's main donor. This has to be said clearly, I think, and criticized loudly, not in order to delegitimize memory, not in order to cancel this institution, Yad Vashem, for I believe that there is such a thing as cancel culture. This is something that's being now hotly debated in Germany. Cancel culture exists and has to be opposed, certainly in relation to institutions like Yad Vashem and the Holocaust's memory. But precisely because if we will not criticize those institutions and memory, if we will not criticize loudly those awful practices of memory, then we will not be able to ensure that they continue to exist. If we fail to criticize them, they will not continue to exist, and Eitam's impending appointment proves that we are already failing. The fact that it can even be proposed that he will become the director, even if in the end he will not, shows that something has gone wrong, deeply wrong. So the book, Israel, Eine, Utopie, the book opens with 2 chapters on the Holocaust and the Nakba and about the politics of remembering and forgetting, trying to connect them to the question of citizenship. I'm going to stop speaking about memory here. I just wanted to put this here for future discussion, and we can later on discuss how I might think that changing our political memory can change also our concept of citizenship. I want to stop speaking about memory and about the Holocaust and its commemoration now, and go and read some parts from the book that focus on the concept of citizenship. So in October 2013, the Israeli Supreme Court rejected the adjective Israeli as an official civil designation in Israel. According to the justices, the contenders, who had asked to be labeled Israeli rather than Jewish on their personal ID cards, did not sufficiently prove the existence of an Israeli nation. For the foreseeable future, therefore, the civil designation of Israel's Jewish citizens remains Jewish. Arab citizens are often designated Arab or sometimes minority. Now, putting aside for the moment the irony involved in the fact that an Israeli court would make such a decision, presumably the court is not a Jewish court, it's an Israeli court, the ruling certainly expressed the overlapping consensus among Israel's Jewish society. The state of Israel is and ought to remain Jewish. Indeed, Zionists and anti-Zionists alike nowadays take it for granted that the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine is what Zionism is essentially about. But then, can a state be both Jewish and a liberal democracy? That's a familiar question. And is it true that Zionism necessarily consists in the idea of a Jewish state. I want to argue, this is one of the main arguments of the book, that a worthwhile future for Israelis and Palestinians depends on realizing that the answer to both questions is negative. A Jewish state cannot be a liberal democracy, but the Zionist ambition for Jewish national self-determination can be preserved. In fact, it is best preserved in a state that is not Jewish. Significantly, this is a fact that Zionism's early leaders and thinkers, from Herzl to Ben-Gurion even, understood, but current liberal Zionist thinkers, again, as well as anti-Zionist thinkers, have managed to forget. And so I would like to shake the passionately held agreement between Zionists and anti-Zionists about what Zionism is and can be, and the Kantian in me would add, and ought to become. So the reading today has some different moving parts because I'm trying to bring together shorter versions of several chapters. So let me outline briefly how the reading is going to unfold so that it's easier to follow the types of arguments that I'm making. First, I will argue against the current concept of liberal Zionism, which clings to the notion of a liberal Jewish state. I'd like to argue very directly and very clearly why a Jewish state cannot be a liberal democracy. Second, I will go historically, or historical, so to speak, to argue that for the founding fathers of Zionism, the telos, the end of Zionist politics, was actually not a Jewish state. It was not about Jewish sovereignty. In fact, they all agreed about binational politics. Lastly, I will go to more recent history and to the often forgotten, and I believe more or less always misunderstood, Begin Plan from 1977, in order to show that binational politics can be actually imagined from within Israel's actual politics. So not just from the deeper origins of Zionism and the further history, but in fact from a part of history that's much more relevant to us. All right, so first, liberal Zionism as we know it. One of the clearest articulations of current liberal Zionist conviction is that of the Israeli philosopher Moshe Halbertal. In an influential Haaretz article, he dismisses the question whether a Jewish state can be a liberal democracy as irrelevant. And here is a quote from Halbertal, I'm reading, quote, "There is no big question whether a state can be both Jewish and a liberal democracy. A serious political intellectual debate should turn rather on the question, what kind of a Jewish state we want to have," end quote. It is worthwhile to return to what Halbertal has to say in this essay. It contains, I think, the most powerful articulation available to us of a liberal Zionism as we know it. So, according to Halbertal, in order to examine whether there is a contradiction in the notion of a Jewish liberal democracy, one must first, quote, find out what a Jewish state is. And he continues, and I continue to quote from Halbertal, "It is possible, of course, to ascribe the adjective Jewish a nationalistic or a religious fundamentalist meaning, and then to argue that a Jewish democratic combination is impossible. But this would be a circular argument and not very fruitful," end quote. Now, this charge of circularity that Halbertal raises is correct, but I think extremely misleading. The question at stake is rather whether any definition of the adjective Jewish and any definition of who's Jewish and who's not would allow us for a state that's Jewish and also a liberal democracy. Halbertal provides a clear answer in the essay, and it is the familiar one. Judaism obviously, that's true, Judaism obviously need not be understood as a fundamentalist religion or as a nationalist ideology. It can also be interpreted as a pluralistic cultural identity. Therefore, given that cultural neutrality is not in Halbertal's view, necessary for democratic liberalism. He believes in the existence of a right to culture. There is no contradiction in the notion of a liberal Jewish state. Now, in an earlier paper, which Halbertal published with another prominent Israeli philosopher, Avishai Margalit, titled Liberalism and the Right to Culture, the two philosophers had argued that, quote, human beings have a right to culture, not just any culture, but their own. They claim that because one's personality is determined, among other things, by one's particular culture, one has a right to preserve this culture and ensure that it would flourish. Moreover, given this right, it is a state's duty to protect culture, not only in some cosmopolitan sense of the term, but to take off the gloves of cultural neutrality that sometimes characterizes liberal democracies and actively defend its citizens' right to their particular cultures. Thus, according to Halbertal and Margalit, and I'm quoting from their article, by the way, published in the New Schools Journal of Social Research, quote, the right to culture in a liberal state permits the state to be culturally neutral, if at all, only with respect to the dominant culture of the majority, and only on the assumption that the dominant culture can take care of itself, end quote. To make this simpler, in his Haaretz article, then Halbertal simply applies this logic to the question of Zionism. While it is Israel's obligation to defend the rights of its minorities to their own culture, it is also its right, in fact, its duty, to defend its majority's right to Judaism. From this perspective, Halbertal argues there is no difference between Israel as a Jewish state and other culturally non-neutral European democracies, such as, quote, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Germany, the Czech Republic, and more. Let me add that other prominent liberal Zionist philosophers have made or assumed similar arguments, among them, as I understand them, Michael Walzer, Avishai Margalit, Joseph Raz, Chaim Gantz, and others. But it is also time to say clearly, I think, this understanding of liberal Zionism is false. In my view, even obviously false, and ought to be left behind, and the reasons are the following. First, despite the fact that Judaism is no doubt a culture, belonging to it still requires what one might regard as the opposite of culture, nature or blood. Religious Jews commonly subscribe to this ethnic condition on who's Jewish and who's not, as do secular Jews, including those to whom religious Judaism is completely passé. Therefore, the comparison between a Jewish and, say, a Finnish state is idle. Even if there is no contradiction in the notion of a Finnish or a German democracy, there is one in the notion of a Jewish democracy. For even if cultural neutrality is not necessary for democratic liberalism, ethnic neutrality certainly is. Quite simply, it is possible to be a Finnish or a Norwegian Jew, just as it is possible to be a German Jew or a Palestinian Muslim or Christian. You can even be a Palestinian Jew. I know a few, bar and bar. But for logical, rather than merely political reasons, it is impossible to become a Christian or a Muslim Jew. Neither, and this is now the crucial point, neither is it possible to be a Muslim or a Christian Israeli, and not merely because, as Israel's Supreme Court insisted, an Israeli nation does not exist, and the adjective Israeli designates nothing official. As long as Israel is essentially a Jewish state, not an Israeli state, being Jewish is essential to being Israeli. A non-Jew can be an Israeli citizen, but only second-class citizen, we'll get to that, and carry a blue identification card and passport, but she or he would not for all that be Israeli. Specifically now, the state would not for all that belong to her. Now, Andrew Pessin, a well-respected expert on early modern philosophy, my profession when I'm not exercising my hobby, writing on Israel, once accused me in the Times of Israel of introducing, and I'm quoting from Pessin, confusions and inconsistencies about the unclarified notion of a state belonging to a people. And I continue to quote from Pessin, Boehm's intellectually and morally corrupt strategy, his dishonest, intentionally introduced logical fallacies are designed to promote an, quote, anti-Semitic double standard against the rights of the Jews to their own country, end quote. So hopefully I managed to get the attention. Repeating this accusation. It's a familiar accusation raised against some types of critics of the Jewish state. So let me address it directly then and specify very carefully what is meant by the idea of a state belonging to its people. I submit that there is nothing confusing, inconsistent, or unclear about the definitions that I see. When Abraham Lincoln avowed democracy at Gettysburg, as famously, quote, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, he expressed the basic idea that democratic states belong to their people. More specifically, the idea is that democratic states belong to their peoples because in democracies, sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. In a Jewish state, however, the clause, the people, designates the Jews rather than citizens, regardless of their religion and race. There is no getting around the fact that a Jewish democracy, therefore, is a government of the Jews, by the Jews, and for the Jews. It is hard to imagine that any current Zionist, liberal or not, would deny that Zionism as we know it is bound to the idea that Jews have the right to their own sovereign Jewish state, to Jewish sovereignty. But then the analogy between the political standing of, say, an Italian Jewish minority and an Arab minority in Israel is futile. Jews in Italy are internally included in their state's political identity and ought to be insulted if anyone questions their belonging to the sovereign Italian people. Arabs in Israel, to put it simply, are not Jewish. Because of their ethnic belonging, sovereignty is not in their hands. In short, if there is no contradiction in the notion of a liberal Jewish democracy, then there isn't one in the notion of a liberal democratic ethnocracy. There is no point in attempting to square this circle, but generations of Israeli philosophers, Albertal, Margalit, Raz, and public intellectuals, David Grossman, Amos Oz, have pretended that they can. Now, it is common to argue that whereas Israel as we know it, occupying the Palestinians, for example, is not a liberal democracy, a Jewish state could have been one in principle if it had only granted non-Jews their full rights. On this prevalent view, the occupation corrupted Zionism. But this is only a contingent fact, an accident that happened to Israel around 1967. Now, this claim sounds commonsensical to many, I think, and it also gives hope to liberal Zionists. If the current situation is only contingent, we can still save Zionist ambitions by salvaging the two-state solution. The country could, in principle, treat the Palestinians differently than it has in the past, and it can do so also in the future. I want to argue that this optimism is false optimism. A Jewish state could not have treated the Palestinians in any other way than it has in the past, and it will not do so in the future. In fact, the idea that it could, in a way, constitutes liberal Zionists' perhaps deepest betrayal of liberal principles, and it is important to see why. An axiomatic assumption driving liberal politics is the familiar thought that in order to defend citizens' rights, political power must be restrained. Where the power of government can be abused, it would be. The separations of power, checks and balances, keeping church and state apart, and committing to binding constitutions are deemed, and this is important philosophically, necessary in order to prevent powerful individuals, classes, and groups from abusing their power and taking over the state, robbing sovereignty from the people. However, since a Jewish democracy expresses Jewish sovereignty, the idea that Jews in their state would grant non-Jews their rights, which clearly isn't successful in practice, isn't good even in theory. If it were, liberal democracies wouldn't be required at all. It would make much more sense, in that case, to let a wise, just sovereign govern and trust that he, I really think it would have been a he, that he would do a better job than the voting multitudes at ensuring the rights of citizens. This type of logic is, of course, familiar, at least since Plato's Republic, but it is hardly a liberal democratic one. It is time to admit that the Jewish people would not grant non-Jews the rights in their Jewish state any more than a benevolent tyrant would give people their rights in his state. In a liberal democracy, the sovereign people gives rights to themselves. The only question is who belongs to the people. Consider here again Halbertal's claim, which I quoted in the outset, that there is, that was a quote, no question whether a state can be Jewish and liberal. I'm quoting now from Halbertal. The only question is what kind of a Jewish state we want to have in Israel, end quote. The most telling word in this quote is, of course, the little word we. Obviously, it designates the Jews. Arabs are not included in the deliberation what type of a Jewish state we want to have in our country. Just imagine this type of logic in Germany, or in Italy, or in Austria. What would be the type of, who would be the political party that would support this type of reasoning? I want to insist that a worthwhile future in Israel, not just for Palestinians, also for Jews, demands that we finally overcome the self-deception that this is or can be liberal democratic logic. Now, the Jewish state, for the reasons that I pointed out here, and I think for other reasons, in fact, but I'm not going to everything, is not and cannot be a liberal democracy. So going on defending the Jewish and democratic slogan, all the more as Israel has obviously buried the two-state solution, and Palestinians, by the way, are not at all a minority in Israel. They constitute at least 50% within Israel's de facto borders. Going on defending in the 21st century the idea that ethnic politics can be liberal is as hopeless as denying global warming. The question is, do we have to leave Zionism behind? And I'm arguing in the book that in some sense we do, and that in some sense we don't. That is, if we cling to the prevalent assumption shared by Zionists and anti-Zionists alike, that Zionism's very essence is the existence of a Jewish state, that the Zionist idea of securing the Jews' right for national self-determination is synonymous with sovereignty, then liberal Zionism ought to be abandoned, as many people argue. But for this reason, now I think is an excellent moment to notice that this assumption is false. That is, Jews may well have the right for national self-determination, but the assumption that this right is necessarily or best defended in a sovereign Jewish state is, to say the least, debatable. I think it's obviously false. Insofar as defending Jews' national and cultural rights is at stake, rather than sacralizing Jewish nationalism, a sub-sovereign political autonomy within a constitutional federative structure could do a better job protecting Jewish education, art, and religion, and preserve the study and the status of Hebrew, a much better job than a Jewish state does. Needless to say, such a federative constellation would also do a better job protecting the national rights of Palestinians alongside that of Jews. Now, if such a sub-sovereign political entity in a federation with the Palestinians sounds like a post or an anti-Zionist utopia, then recall that Theodor Herzl's 1902 utopian novel, Alt Neuland, envisions the socio-economic, cultural, and political life in the state of the Jews as a non-sovereign cultural political autonomy, lying side by side with other such autonomies under Ottoman sovereignty. The idea of a fully fledged Jewish sovereignty was altogether foreign to Herzl's thoughts, and that's the point now, and dreams. But he was not for all that less of a Zionist. Most Herzl interpreters have been tempted to assume that Alt Neuland's Jewish autonomy model represented a break from his 1896 Zionist manifesto, The Jewish State, which, as seems to be obviously suggested by its title, stands for Jewish statehood and sovereignty. Either a radical shift in Herzl thinking, the argument goes, or an attempt to conceal his treasonous ambitions vis-à-vis Palestine's Ottoman rulers are responsible for Alt Neuland's portrayal of the Jewish state as mere autonomous district in Palestine rather than a sovereign nation state. However, someone who has argued this beautifully and powerfully recently is Dmitry Chomsky, someone with whom often I agree and also often disagree. However, the idea that Herzl's Alt Neuland and the Jewish state stand for different Zionist visions is nothing but a myth. One that in all likelihood has been created by ideological misinterpretation of Herzl's work from the retroactive perspective of the sovereign Jewish state. That is, presenting the state as the obvious, necessary telos of Zionist politics all along. There is every reason to assume that no break in Herzl's Zionist ambitions or thinking ever occurred. When European nations in Herzl's time, say the Czech or the Hungarians, spoke about attaining their own state, they had in mind a national territorial autonomy, national self-determination under imperial sovereignty. State in Herzl's The Jewish State is the same non-sovereign political entity Herzl would later describe in Alt Neuland. In other words, by the false understanding of Zionism that has been created in the meantime, Herzl would be an anti-Zionist. And not just he. The same retroactive ideological distortion is responsible for the common understanding of Ahad Ha'am's position as cultural, as an essentially cultural rather than political form of Zionism. In fact, Ahad Ha'am's Zionism was as political as it could be. Well aware of the existence of a Palestinian people in the land, he advocated for a Jewish cultural autonomy in Palestine, existing alongside the Palestinian autonomy in one binational federation. Only retrospective ideology can dismiss his Zionist binational politics as non-political. And here's a quote from Ahad Ha'am. I'm going to read it. Quote, The situation makes Palestine a joint home of different nations, each of which is trying to build its own traditional home. In such a situation, it is no longer possible for the national home of one of them to be complete and encompass every aspect of this term, that is, sovereignty. If you do not go about building your home in a field empty of people, but rather in a place where there are other homes and residents, then of course you can only be the sole ruler inside your own gates. There inside, you can organize your belongings as you see fit. But beyond your gates, all residents of the area must work together, and the overall leadership must be agreed upon for the benefit of all. End quote. So again, on the main current political question, a Jewish state, for and against, these Zionist founding fathers, Herzl and Echad Ha'am, agreed. They were, for a principled reason, against. Now, in public consciousness, and sometimes also among experts, it is common to think that the binational Zionism of Echad Ha'am's cultural, rather than allegedly political soul, enjoyed no lasting continuity, or that if it did, then only among the far-fetched Brit Shalom movement, elaborated by intellectuals like Martin Buber or Magnus or Hannah Arendt in some formation. But in fact, Brit Shalom's continuity with Echad Ha'am's position was due to the significance that they gave to the revival of Hebrew and Jewish culture, not to their allegedly post-Zionist binational politics, which, up until very late in history, remained a matter of consensus among Zionists. For example, criticizing Brit Shalom in 1926, Jabotinsky, the raving right-wing Zionist nationalist, objected to their wish to establish a Jewish state too soon, while Palestine's Jewish population was still a tiny minority. However, on their binational plan, Jabotinsky made sure to emphasize there is absolutely no disagreement. Quote, here's a fast quote from Jabotinsky for time's sake. For those of you who know Jabotinsky, this is often very surprising, right? Quote, the future of Palestine must be founded, legally speaking, as a binational state, end quote. If I hadn't told you that this was Jabotinsky, I could have convinced you that this was Hannah Arendt, commonly regarded as anti or post-Zionist. It's coming from Jabotinsky, the father of Menachem Begin, and allegedly of people like Benjamin Netanyahu. Ben-Gurion, similarly to Herzl and Jabotinsky, was initially committed to an autonomous national district under Ottoman sovereignty as well. Once the empires collapsed in the aftermath of the First World War, he began advocating for a sovereign Jewish state, but he had anything but abandoned his vision of a decentralized government, very much akin to Jabotinsky's idea about a binational state in which both Jews and Palestinians exercise national self-determination in cultural autonomies. That is, by sovereignty. When Ben-Gurion starts speaking about sovereignty, up until 1936, he seems to be meaning, for the most part, national self-determination. Here's a quote from Ben-Gurion. I'm quoting. Whatever kind of government there will be in Palestine, in such a country with such a great multiplicity of races, ethnicities, religions, international political connections, and socio-cultural doctrines, it is impossible that there could be one law and one government. The situation in the country necessitates an autonomous arrangement for all the many habitations in Palestine. Our aim is not to rule over others, not to be a ruler nation like all the other ruler nations. Our goal is that we be masters of our own fate, no more than that and no less. All other notions undermine our existence in Palestine. I want to emphasize here something. I'm reading again a quote here. Our aim is not to rule over others. When Ben-Gurion, a reader of Plato, by the way, emphasizes that it is not our aim to rule over others as a ruler nation, he does not speak of a regime like the West Bank's military occupation, which of course back then he could not foresee. He spoke of Palestinians living in a Jewish state under Jewish sovereignty. Back then, at least, he understood that a Jewish and democratic formula is contradictory. Autonomy was thus the desired model for both Jewish and Palestinian self-determination. The Jews would be able to run their lives, but without corrupting themselves as a ruler nation. In other words, not the occupation corrupts Zionism here, but the idea of Jewish sovereignty over others. Now, in the early 30s, again, the early 30s, the principle that was outlined in the paragraph from Ben-Gurion, which I just read, were gathered into a quasi-constitutional document drafted by Ben-Gurion himself, titled Assumptions for Determining a Governmental Regime in Palestine. In this document, Ben-Gurion specifies his vision, and I'm quoting again. Palestine would become a federal state whose subsections will be: 1, the municipal government of the village and the city, which is completely independent; 2, cantons that comprise autonomous states within the federal Palestinian government. Every canton is able to write its constitution for itself. No canton can pass a law that restricts or violates the rights and equality of another canton's residents. Every citizen has equal rights in all cantons. 3, the national autonomy would have complete authority in the areas of education, culture, and language, according to the constitution that would be passed by the founding assembly. End quote. Once a quintessential Zionist consensus, then, the idea of binational federation was obliterated from Zionist political thinking. And I'm not entering here how it was obliterated, but in very brief, it was obliterated by the Holocaust and by the idea of transferring the Palestinians, the fact that the politics of transfer became possible in Palestine. In our post-two-state solution era, the political question that we have to ask, I think, is the following. Can such binationalism, Zionist binationalism, be revived? Is it possible to think such politics from within Israel's actual politics, in view of the reality of the Jewish state that already exists, in view of the occupation of the Palestinians? And I want to suggest that despite appearances, and despite this being admittedly very far-fetched, it can at least be imagined, and it ought to be imagined. Now, it is all too common, in order to see how it can be imagined, I want to go to the Menachem Begin plan that's revived in the book, and say a few surprising words about this, I think. And with this, I'm going to finish and we can move to the discussion. So it is all too common nowadays to speculate whether Rabin, if he was not murdered, would have managed to push through a two-state solution, or to debate how far Ehud Olmert or Ehud Barak were prepared to go in order to achieve separation from the Palestinians. These idle what-if speculations, I think, mostly reveal the limits of our thinking, the barriers imposed on what seems possible and what cannot be imagined under current political constraints and taboos. It would be much more fruitful today to turn the gaze further back to Menachem Begin. Israel's first right-wing prime minister, a disciple of Jabotinsky, rejected all territorial compromise in 1947 when Ben-Gurion famously celebrated the UN's partition resolution. In the late 70s, however, when pressed by President Carter and Egypt's President Anwar Sadat to include and offer to the Palestinians as part of the peace agreement with Egypt, he returned to them with a surprising plan. At first, the proposal titled, quote, Home Rule for Palestinian Arabs, residents of Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district, dated December 15, 1977, was kept as a top secret. The plan, I think, is worth quoting, and I'm going to read a little bit from the plan. I try to do it brief so that we can come to conclusion and only read the important parts. 1. The administration of the military government in the West Bank and Gaza will be abolished. 2. An administrative autonomy of the resident, by them, and for them will be established in the West Bank and Gaza. 3. All administrative affairs of the areas of the West Bank and Gaza will be under the direction and within the competence of this Palestinian Administrative Council. 4. And jetzt pass auf. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza will be offered full Israeli citizenship. 5. A committee will be established with representatives of Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Administrative Council to determine, quote now, well, it was quote so far, norms whereby Arab refugees residing outside the West Bank and Gaza district will be permitted to immigrate to these areas in reasonable numbers. Begin specified in a separate letter to Carter that they speak of numbers in the hundreds of thousands. That's a comment about the, what was it in Yehuda Bauer, genocidal anti-Semitism, the right of return. 6. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza who choose Israeli citizenship will be entitled to vote for and be elected to the Knesset. 7. Residents of Israel will be entitled to acquire land and settle in the areas of the West Bank and Gaza. Arabs, residents of the West Bank and Gaza, that is, whether citizens or those who chose not to be, will be entitled to acquire land and settle in Israel. 8. Residents of Israel and residents of the West Bank and Gaza will be assured full freedom of movement and freedom of economic activity in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. End quote. Now, most Israelis are unaware that a plan of this sort ever existed. Those who do remember it have heard of the Begin Plan, and they call it the Begin Autonomy Plan. And they know that Begin offered Palestinians mere autonomy, but the most striking element in this plan, namely the fact that this autonomy was coupled with the option for full Israeli citizenship to every Palestinian, remains overlooked. Not just overlooked. When Israelis hear of that part of the plan, they are confident that the facts are wrong, the facts that I just read you, and that this plan ever existed. And I understand why. It simply contradicts the world as we have come to know it. Israelis grasp correctly that whereas offering Palestinians a mere autonomy is giving them less than a state, so far the story makes sense. Offering them autonomy and full Israeli citizenship goes a long way towards a binational, one-state federation. By the way, experts' views are similar on this point. They tend to either dismiss Begin's plan as a mere weird anecdote, or to evaluate this program from within the axiomatic two-state prism. In a 2016 book that's dedicated to the viability of the two-state solution, Nathan Thrall, one of the strongest commentators on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is no coy statement, he is a wonderful commentator, I'm saying this because I am going to criticize him here, mentions the Begin plan as an interesting anecdote, pointing out that it was later dropped, quote, to the great relief of subsequent Israeli government. But not much more than that. Sessan Siska, in his newly published, defining really top research on the history and aftermath of Begin's autonomy plan, treats it primarily as a program that's designed to prevent Palestine, a plot to undermine the Palestinians' aspiration to national sovereignty. But I want to suggest that there is another way to look at this allegedly anonymous, surprising plan, and that is to view it from outside the limiting constraints of the two-state prism. Begin's proposal contained a remarkable step, not just to preventing Palestine, although surely that too, but to a binational, one-state solution. Not an ideal step, not one that could or should satisfy the Palestinians' demands, but still a plan that breaks the main barriers on our ability to imagine what's possible and what's not as we move into one-state reality. For one thing, whereas it is true that the Palestinians aren't offered full national sovereignty in this program, this is Ansiska's point, I take it, full national sovereignty is not required for national self-determination, as I've pointed out earlier, not for the Palestinians and not for Jews. More significantly, by offering Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza full Israeli citizenship, they are offered meaningful participation in Israeli sovereignty. Now, that's a crucial point now. Whereas sovereignty belongs in democracies to the people, in a Jewish state, as I argued here and made it particularly strong, the people are the Jews, not all citizens as such, not even if all Palestinians are offered citizenship. And yet here precisely lies the absolutely crucial point. It is due to this fact, that is, a Jewish state is a state of the Jews, that offering citizenship to all Palestinians seems inconceivable from within the familiar Zionist axioms. Therefore, Begin's plan in this view does not just prevent Palestinian sovereignty. It also transforms and radically reshapes the meaning of Jewish sovereignty in Israel, pushing it not to the limit, but definitely beyond the limits of Zionism as we've come to know it, and into a politics that's more familiar from the original binational Zionism. Only once we finally abandon this axiomatic two-state prism and the related assumption that national self-determination must be achieved through full sovereignty for Palestinians or Jews can Begin's plan become a subversive tool. Not just subversive, also a constructive tool. Not to preventing Palestine, but for imagining a binational one-state federation in which liberal Zionists of the future will have to begin to imagine. The plan's power consists in the fact that whereas binational politics is today rejected as post or even anti-Zionist, it is in fact fully continuous with the original Zionist consensus. And of course, no one would dismiss Begin as a post-Zionist. And here is a point: the Knesset did it. On December 28th, 1977, having just returned from a meeting with Anwar Sadat, Begin read it, the plan, line by line from the Knesset's podium, defended it against fierce objections, warned Israelis and Israel's parliament that if the program is not adopted, Israel will become an apartheid state, and proposed to vote. Quote, "Mr. Speaker, the debate is ended. I ask for a vote, and I ask that each and every member of the Knesset, without distinction of faction, vote according to his conscience. There is no imposition, no coercion. I am confident of the result." End quote. On the question of giving Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank an autonomy, leave the question of full sovereignty in these territories open, offer every Palestinian the option to become full Israeli citizen, recognizing the right of return of Palestinian refugees in limited but significant numbers, and the right to full economic liberty and freedom of movement on the whole territory. Well, obviously, they are citizens. Israel's Knesset, the parliament, voted 64 in favor, and 8 against. 40 abstained. A future for Israelis and Palestinians in our post-two-state solution era depends on extending visions of the sort. It's not going to be Begin's actual vision, it shouldn't be, but extending them into federative politics, pushing the notion of sovereignty beyond that of Jewish sovereignty or Palestinian sovereignty, and endorsing full equality and full equal citizenship to all the inhabitants of the land. Sovereign would be the people who live in the country where both people, Jewish and Palestinians, can still exercise national self-determination. Moshe Halbertal argued that there was no question whether a Jewish state can be a liberal democracy. And at least on that, I think he's right. There cannot be a Jewish state, cannot be a liberal democracy. He also argued that the only question was what kind of a Jewish state we want to have. Seems to me that the liberal Zionism of the future would depend on a completely different question. It will not be what type of a Jewish state we want to have, but what type of a state we, the inhabitants of Palestine's territory, Eretz Israel, would venture to develop. This is no doubt very far-fetched, but not impossible to imagine. Herzl's original Zionist motto thus remains as relevant as it has ever been. If you will it, it is not a dream. I'm done.
Omri, vielen Dank für diese spannende Einführung in dein Buch. Du hast es tatsächlich geschafft, durch deine Argumentation einen sozusagen Weg hindurchzuschlagen, der sehr neugierig macht, es ganz zu lesen. Neugierig bin ich aber auch auf deine Antworten auf die schon vielen Fragen, die sich mittlerweile bei uns angesammelt haben. Und deswegen beginne ich auch einfach gleich mit den Fragen aus der Runde. Ich beginne mal mit dem ersten, nämlich Axel Jonek aus Konstanz, der vor allem 2 Fragen gestellt hat, die eigentlich eng miteinander zusammenhängen. Und die Frage ist eigentlich vor allem die, gibt es in Israel denn politische Kräfte, er sagt Partei, aber es gibt ja auch außerhalb der Parteien politische Kräfte, die ähnliche Gedanken wie du vertrittst und die überhaupt sozusagen für ein Zusammenleben in einem binationalen Staat eintreten würden?
Ja, so would,
selbe Frage kommt auch aus München von Ralf D. ja im Prinzip.
Do we have how much support and how much political power we find for this?
Ich habe versprochen, auf Deutsch zu antworten.
Ich mache das auf Deutsch. Okay. Die Antwort, ist kompliziert. Natürlich gibt es gerade nicht viele Kräfte, die eine solche Politik unterstützen. Aber wir können anfangen zu sehen, dass diese Politik jetzt nötig ist und dass man beginnt, das zu merken. Ja? Die ältere liberal-zionistische Parteien, Meretz und Labour, wenn das eine liberal-zionistische Partei war, sind jetzt so gut wie fertig. Also sie sind sehr schwach und werden nicht mehr lang überleben, weil es ist klar, dass die Zwei-Staaten-Lösung tot ist. Und man ist ständig auf die Suche nach neuen Alternativen. Es ist klar, dass nur eine Zusammenarbeit mit arabischen Parteien das Programm von Liberalpolitik gerettet sein kann. Ich denke, dass wir werden bald erfahren, ob die Notwendigkeit von einer solchen Lösung auch Kräfte bringt, die eine solche Politik unterstützt. Und ich bin eigentlich optimistisch, dass das jetzt irgendwie im Zentrum von der israelischen Politik stehen kann, das glaube ich nicht, natürlich. Also wir werden das nicht bald finden als eine große Partei mit viel Kraft, aber als ein Anfang. Und ehrlich gesagt, die einzige Alternative auf das, was wir gerade sehen, ja, weil eigentlich gibt es keine Alternative auf Benjamin Netanyahu. Alle wurden, also wenn Netanyahu jetzt nicht im Likud war, wurden mehr oder weniger alle israelischen Parteien, die rechts zu den Vereinigten Liste, the Joint Party, the Joint List, können mehr oder weniger zusammensetzen in einer Koalition. Die Israelis, die noch links denken, oder nicht mal links, sondern liberal, würden bald entscheiden müssen, ob sie zusammen mit den Arabern Politik machen oder zusammen mit den Rechten. Von daher sehe ich doch, dass es auch Hoffnung für eine solche Politik gibt.
Die nächsten Fragen, und es sind eigentlich mehrere, schließen eigentlich direkt an das an, was du gerade gesagt hast. Und ich werde mal die Fragen zusammenfassen. Da ist eine Frage von Joachim Gierlichs, nämlich wirklich, wie wird jetzt dein Buch von Seiten der Palästinenser aufgenommen und wie sollen sie einbezogen werden? Und vielleicht auch die Frage, ob auch eine Übersetzung ins Arabische deines Buches geplant ist. Dann habe ich eine Frage, die eigentlich dasselbe Thema trifft, auch wenn sie sozusagen zurückgeht in die späten 70er Jahre oder 80er Jahre, nämlich eine Frage von Bärbel Illy. Die palästinensische Seite hat sich auf den Begin-Plan nie eingelassen. Komisch.
Ich habe das nicht gehört, Hanno. Kannst du das wiederholen?
Die palästinensische Seite hat sich auf den Begin-Plan nie eingelassen. Warum? Und ich bekomme auch noch eine Frage, die eigentlich dieselbe Richtung geht, ob du im Gespräch mit Palästinensern eigentlich bist über diese Vorstellung eines binationalen Staates, also dass es auch eine Kommunikation darüber gibt. Ja, ich bleib jetzt mal bei diesen 3 Beiträgen eigentlich zum selben Thema.
Ob das Buch ins Arabische übersetzt, ich bin völlig dafür, dass das Buch auch ins Arabische übersetzt wird. Aber ja, Hanno, ich mache das auf Englisch, weil jetzt sind also 3 Fragen so.
Okay.
It's hard for me to speak for Arabs. Interestingly enough, and this is part of my program. Tut mir leid, Hanno, aber das wird nicht.
Go on English.
It's easier for me, and this is part of the form of my answer will be have something to do with its content. It's easier for me to speak for how I understand Israelis. And by Israelis, I understand not just Jews, but also Arabs. Although I am an Israeli Jew and not an Israeli Arab. It is my understanding that slowly Israeli Arabs see themselves more and more as part of Israeli society, and that a political union that will be genuinely equal, that will mean a genuine joint representation, will enjoy a lot of support among Israeli Arabs. I did not run a poll. I also have the advantage that I speak as a Kantian. Kantians, I don't know if this is surprising.
Ein Kantianer, das muss ich
Kantianer, ja. Uns sind die Fakten eigentlich weniger wichtig. Ja? Mir ist wichtig, was sollen wir machen? Ich denke, die Araber sollen das unterstützen. Und ich denke, wir fangen an auch zu sehen, dass sie das machen. Sicherlich innerhalb von Israel, aber möglicherweise auch außerhalb von Israel. Und hier gibt es einen wichtigen Punkt. Es gibt gerade, there is at the moment a vacuum of leadership. A vacuum of leadership inside Israel, but also a vacuum of leadership within the Palestinian society, as far as I can say, as far as I can see. Abbas, for example, is hardly a convincing leader, and it's not clear who is going to be the next leader who is not corrupt and is truly interested in the rights of the Palestinian people. There is at the same time, as I said, a vacuum of leadership on the Israeli left, and there is not just a vacuum of leadership because we still haven't found the next beautiful general who will come on a white horse and save the Israeli left against Benjamin Netanyahu, but rather there is a vacuum of a political program. And it seems to me that the right political program that will speak for a joint politics of Arabs and Jews will be able to fill the political vacuum for Arabs and Jews. And we'll have a lot of convincing. So I'm realizing I'm not answering the question directly, but I am answering it to the best of my ability indirectly. The answer is, there seems to me that for the time being, there's not a lot of support, but there is some support. But there seems to me that there is a huge vacuum of leadership and political thinking on both sides, and that this vacuum can be filled by giving courageous, imaginative, just political programs. Do I think that this is far-fetched? Yes. I think it's our only chance.
Ich schließe mal eine Frage an, die dazu eigentlich, wenn man so will, gut passt, von Amin al-Maghrebi. Inwiefern schaden die Antinormalisierungsbewegung und Kampagnen wie beispielsweise BDS den gemeinsamen israelisch-palästinensischen Kampf für zivile Rechte der Palästinenser in Israel und den palästinensischen Gebieten? Wie nehmen Sie solche Bewegungen wahr und haben Sie, also diese Bewegungen, BDS zum Beispiel, haben BDS und andere eben ihre Arbeit und Aktivismus, also deine Arbeit und Aktivismus schwieriger gemacht? Eine spannende Frage, finde ich.
Sehr. Difficult and interesting question. And this is why, again, it will be answered in English. I do not support BDS personally. I have some reasons not to support them. I'm not going to catalog them here, but I also do not find BDS illegitimate. I think BDS is legitimate, to say the least. I think that the method of boycotting Israel and Israeli institutions, that's the argument, that do not clearly distance themselves from the occupation, seems to me to be a legitimate affair. It is, however, not one with which I personally agree. And I disagree with it, not because I share different goals necessarily from BDS, whatever the goals are. Part of my problem with BDS is that it's not always clear enough to me what the goals are, can be discussed. My goal, as you may see, is to speak of a genuine collaboration of Arabs and Jews. And in a way, my position is exactly opposite to BDS. But please do not misunderstand what I'm saying when I'm saying that it's exactly the opposite to BDS, because it's not opposite as in the sense of object to BDS, like, say, liberal Zionists often do or something like that. It is exactly opposite in its radical nature, because I also agree that normalizing the Israeli occupation by sitting again Israelis, nice Israelis and nice Palestinians to have talks is just a form of eternalizing the occupation. We're going to continue to talk for the next 50 years and have nice, Israelis will present themselves, nice liberals, while the Palestinians will be under military occupation. I'm very much against this normalization of the Israeli occupation. The question is whether we're going to respond to it by saying we are a we and a they, and the they, now the Israelis, have to be boycotted, or whether we'll manage from within Israel to actually try to transform consciousness, not by breaking it, so to speak, not by forcing Israelis to finally break with their bad politics, but rather to change it to actual collaboration with the Palestinians. That is, I think, my method, and this is why I do not see BDS as, I think, a joint Arab-Jewish party, which in some sense is exactly opposite to BDS, is the most radical thing that we can offer. I think that speaking about Jews who will abandon the Zionism of the Jewish state and speak very clearly about the Nakba, speak very clearly about the fact that in order to establish a Jewish state, the Palestinians had to be expelled. Make that talk about history as part of their politics. I think that this is much more radical than BDS, and much more, and cannot live with it. So it will not, in the party that I would like to see forming, that party will not be able to support BDS, but it will be much more radical in its insistence on collaboration, because unlike anti-Zionist parties, that party will have the power to transform Zionism and to transform our concept of citizenship. That's why I'm not a big BDS supporter, since this is a talk that's taking place in Europe and, well, in German, let's call it. It's not. Let me say that I think that the BDS Beschluss of the German Parliament is a disaster. I personally am no BDS fan. I'm on paper criticizing Judith Butler's position on BDS, but BDS is a legitimate activity, and the delegitimation of it is grotesque.
Danke, aber ich glaube, du bist sehr auf die Frage wirklich eingegangen. Ich glaube, die hat ein ähnliches Ziel eigentlich verfolgt, zu fragen, also ob Kooperation nicht viel radikaler ist als Boykott. Ich habe zwei Fragen von Hans-Peter Büchi. Ich muss versuchen, sie ein bisschen zusammenzufassen, denn sie sind sehr lang, aber ich versuche es. Er hat gleich auf Englisch gefragt. Why do you speak of the right of return as Resolution 194 was a non-binding resolution of the UN General Assembly? Apart from that, more than 70% of the Palestinians were immigrants themselves, respektive their descendants. Damit ist, glaube ich, gemeint, 70% of the Palestinians were already immigrants in Palestine, because there was migration in the Middle East. I guess that's the point. Hans-Peter Büchi also asks about your perception of the Balfour Declaration, which he says became part of the international law in San Remo in 1920, and that the Balfour Declaration spoke of a national home for the Jewish people, whereas the civil and the religious rights of the existing of other communities had to be protected. Already in 1918, the politicians spoke of a later Jewish state, which was also in compliance with Article 22 of the Statutes of the League of Nations. This did not work because already in 1920, I still quote, the question Amin al-Husseini started to fight the Jews because Islamic rule does not allow on Dar al-Islam any state governed by non-Muslims. So the question is, would Muslims tolerate a non-Muslim state on territories in the Middle East? The so-called peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt are mere armistice agreements. Read the still valid, never changed charter of the PLO demanding the destruction of Israel. Why did Abbas, so that is coming to a question, why did Abbas not accept Israel's offer in 2008? Full stop.
Do you really want me to answer everything? How much time do you give me?
No, start with the end. Why did Abbas not accept Israel's offer in 2008?
I did not hear the name of the gentleman who asked the question, but I think that I understand the the overall picture and the overall details, and the full picture that was painted, and I can try to the best of my ability to answer it as fully as I can. This is a systematic question, and it would have, to be full, it would have to be systematic. First, about the why did Abbas not accept the offer? I will start with that because politically, I think in many ways it's the most important question. It's not just about the past. I don't know why he didn't accept it, but I know why he cannot accept it. And I think that a lot of our assumptions here are wrong. People sometimes think that the problem of the two-state solution begins with the number of settlers in the West Bank. And then they say, well, Abbas was offered basically, a return to the 67 borders and so on and so forth. And he still didn't take it. That's because he wants to destroy the Jewish state. Let me correct a fallacy that, I'm not actually a fan of the colonialist accusation, but I think that there is a colonialist fallacy here, and that we need to notice it. In the territory between the Jordan River and the sea, currently lives a Palestinian majority. I'll say it again, in the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, currently lives a Palestinian majority. The two-state solution that Abbas was offered, I can't remember the exact numbers, but did not go over offering him 22% of the territory. 22% for the majority of the population, a territory that is discontinuous. You have Gaza and the West Bank, a territory that would have had Ariel stuck in the middle of the West Bank, and would have still been full with Israeli settlers, even if hundreds of thousands of them would have been evacuated. The answer is that when we go about offering the Palestinians generous two-state offers, and we don't understand why they cannot be accepted, and then say they did not accept it because they still want to destroy the Jewish state. And then we also throw in, you will excuse me, the name Amin al-Husseini, the Hitler supporter, and we say, see, the Palestinians are proto-Nazis, and for that reason they reject the two-state solution, and we have to fight. No, I think that if we look at the map in serious political eyes, if we look at the map and want to do realpolitik, but realpolitik not of extreme right people who are willing to expel the Palestinians in the end, but realpolitik of the question, how can we solve the situation in the territory, offering the majority of the population, the Palestinians, 22% of the territory that's discontinuous, is not an offer that they, in the end, can accept. And just imagine, I mean, why don't we actually suggest this to the Jews? Take the Jews, they're less than 50% than the population, and squeeze the state of Israel in 22% of that territory. I'm not for that solution. I think it would be an awful solution. This is what's being offered generously to the Palestinians. I think that's a colonialist offer, and not being, mind you, I'm on paper criticizing overblown post-colonialist critiques, not my position, but there is such a thing as colonialist positions, and that's one of them. I think, so I don't know why Abbas rejected the offer, but that's, that could have been a good reason. That's also why, if we want to look for a realistic way forward, we need to go beyond the two-state solution. That's to go to the last of your comments. To go to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration offered the Jews, as far as I can tell, national self-determination, very much in line with the position that I'm suggesting. I'm not a fan of the Balfour Declaration. I don't know if that surprises you. At all. And I'm not a fan of it because it was a colonialist suggestion. When it was offered, when the Balfour Declaration was suggested, Palestine's population was about, the Jewish population was about 10% of the population in the territory. One empire that did not even rule the territory, but could already foresee that it was going to control it in the future, offered this 10% a national home in that territory. I'm not a fan of that logic. However, I do think that that declaration and its language is consistent with the idea of a national home, that is national self-determination for the Jews. The right of return of the Palestinians, I'm not sure that I remember or that I completely understood or even heard adequately the question. The right of return of the Palestinians is crucial, because it is crucial for me as an Israeli Jew who wants to recognize the full equal citizenship of my fellow compatriot Palestinians. It is crucial for me to understand that the Palestinians were driven out of the country in Israel's War of Independence, and that only if we recognize the right of return will we have equal citizenship. Without this recognition, there will not be equal citizenship. This does not mean that every Palestinian now who wishes to return to Israel needs to receive this right. However, the right has to be recognized, meaningfully recognized. I think I showed that it does not have to be such a taboo. There are ways of recognizing this right. You said something about the Palestinians being immigrants. If Hanno understood you correctly and I understood Hanno correctly, the idea was that Palestinians immigrated recently to Israel. They were not hundreds of years in the territory, but they just arrived before. Frankly, I don't think very highly of that objection. First, I doubt very much that it's consistent with the historical facts, but I think it doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter at all because my grandmother immigrated to Palestine in 1939. My father was born in 49, by the way, 71 years today. I was born in 79. We are children of immigrants. And I do not think that anybody has a right to kick us out of our homes. I do not think that it matters whether the Palestinians immigrated or not to Palestine. That's unfortunate logic.
Es sind noch ziemlich viele Fragen jetzt eingegangen, die wir nicht mehr alle diskutieren können, einfach weil ein Zoom-Event, das irgendwie länger als 1,5 Stunden dauert, dann doch an der Konzentrationsfähigkeit von uns allen ziemlich zehrt. Es gibt einige Fragen, die immer wieder aber um dasselbe Thema kreisen, nämlich zu der Frage, wie man tatsächlich, so sagt es Jochi Weil aus Zürich, zu konstruktiven Allianzen kommen kann zwischen Palästinenserinnen und Israelis. Oder wie man arabische Staaten, auch die Frage ist hier gestellt, es gibt ja im Moment so eine Entwicklung, dass Israel Beziehungen aufnimmt mit arabischen Staaten, ob man die tatsächlich dafür gewinnen könnte, solche Überlegungen und Vorstellungen zu unterstützen. Das ist sozusagen eine Frage, aber da hast du eigentlich sehr deutlich darauf geantwortet, dass du dir das wünschst, aber durchaus auch nicht sozusagen so optimistisch bist, dass das sozusagen von heute auf morgen gleich passiert.
Let me be more optimistic. Sorry. No, I'm listening.
Es gibt eine Frage, die ich am Ende doch noch mal ganz kurz stellen möchte, weil sie kommt von Ruth, also Ruth Frank, unserer Mitveranstalterin. Sie schreibt, I don't agree with you at all about the acceptance of BDS. Ich habe dich jetzt ehrlich gesagt nicht so verstanden, dass du irgendwie BDS besonders unterstützen würdest. Dann schreibt sie weiter, Ruth schreibt weiter, they are not helping anybody, neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians.
Okay, I see the question. I can answer this briefly. Thanks, Ruth. I'm not sure. It depends on the meaning by the term acceptance of BDS. I accept BDS as legitimate. I do not support BDS. By the way, go and search my article against BDS in the Los Angeles Review of Books. I disagree with Judith Butler's logic, and I argue at length why I think it's a fallacy. But I believe it's definitely legitimate, and I think that it's legitimate for several reasons. But I'll give you the fastest one. The fastest one is that the Palestinians have a right to resist. I wonder what you would make. What types of resistance do people in Germany, say Austria, think that the Palestinians have as a legitimate type of resistance? I take it blowing buses in Tel Aviv is illegitimate. Hopefully we all agree about that. I definitely agree about that. I also think that shooting Qassam missiles from Gaza arbitrarily on southern Israel is completely illegitimate. I do think that targeting Israeli soldiers is not illegitimate. Just as Israel has a right to defend itself, the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. And fighting against the Israeli military is a legitimate action. That is, it is not a form of terrorism. The tendencies that we're constantly seeing in German public debates, and European public debates, and in American public debates, and I think we haven't noticed this little fact. There is actually no form of legitimate resistance of the Palestinians. What would it be? If the Palestinians wish to join the International Court in The Hague, that's being delegitimized as, that's a quote, diplomatic terrorism. They want to boycott Israeli institutions that are completely complicit in the occupation, when people say that this is anti-Semitism. I think that if we are to be honest with ourselves, we have to insist that precisely because the Palestinians have a right, they have national rights, they have civil rights, and that these rights are under fierce attack. They have forms of legitimate, serious resistance to the occupation, and that as Israelis, as Jews maybe, I do not know you, Ruth, personally, it's not always nice to recognize that people have the right to attack us, but they do. And we should not participate in the delegitimation of the right. It is inherently, the right to resist is inherent to the right of those people, I mean it, to exist. There is just a split between just delegitimizing any form of resistance against Israel as anti-Semitic, and going all the way, God forbid, I do not imagine for a second that you will go there, to logic like FEA town. That's my position on BDS, and this is why I would, as a good liberal, and it is said with tongue in cheek, as a good liberal, I disagree with them, but I would fight their right to resist the occupation. I would fight against anyone who wants to, and I have, who wants to blow buses in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And when people cross those borders, it's immediately clear, and I immediately steige aus. Not even, I have no patience to any form of legitimate terrorism. That's I do see the practices in which those moments create. We need to walk that fine line, and I think that's for me the reason why I insist on defending BDS.
Ich habe mich heute moderierend aus der Diskussion ziemlich zurückgehalten, mache das sonst nicht immer, aber ich erlaube mir, die heutige Diskussion mit ein paar Gedanken von meiner Seite zu beschließen. Sie wird weitergehen, die ist ja nicht heute Abend zu Ende. Sie wird an vielen Orten geführt werden und auch wir werden sie weiterführen. Das große Problem für mich ist, dass BDS eine Logik unterstützt, die für mich dieselbe Logik ist, die die Gegner von BDS mit leider noch sehr viel mehr Machtmitteln in der Welt exekutieren, nämlich die Logik, die BDS on the ground, also in der Praxis, leider immer wieder unterstützt und fortsetzt, ist halt die Logik des Nicht-Miteinander-Kooperierens. Und das ist, wenn ich über Waffenkonzerne rede, sicherlich eine Sache, aber wenn ich über Cultural Boycott und der Cultural Boycott, also das Boykottieren von Diskussionen, von kulturellem Austausch, von Auftritten von Intellektuellen und Wissenschaftlern spreche, egal ob mir das gefällt, was sie sagen oder nicht, oder Künstlern, wenn ich in diese Logik hineingehe, dann finde ich es eben tatsächlich eine zerstörerische Logik, obwohl ich persönlich das Recht auf Widerstand jederzeit unterschreiben würde. Und ich würde auch jederzeit widersprechen, dass die Logik diese sozusagen tatsächlich auch Torpedierens vom Gespräch antisemitisch ist. Ich finde sie einfach nur politisch dumm. Ich finde sie politisch zerstörerisch. So wie ich es zerstörerisch finde, Leuten das Mikrofon oder Räume oder anderes zu verbieten, weil sie irgendwann mal vor, ich weiß nicht was, 5 Jahren irgendeine BDS-Resolution unterschrieben haben. Das ist noch absurder. Und das ist die Praxis, die aus diesem BDS-Verbot oder aus dieser Resolution des Bundestages hervorgegangen ist. Eines der spannendsten Dokumente, und damit möchte ich jetzt schließen von meiner Seite, eines der spannendsten Dokumente, das ich in den letzten Tagen gelesen habe, war eine Resolution von 122 palästinensischen und arabischen Intellektuellen, Palästinensern, arabischen Intellektuellen in Frankreich, Amerika, unterschiedlichen Orten, aber eben auch in Israel und in der Westbank und in Palästina, die sich sehr intensiv mit dem Antisemitismus beschäftigt haben und damit beschäftigt haben, was die Wirkung des Tabuisierens von BDS ist, nämlich eben auch das Zerstören jeder Diskussion. Und das Interessante ist, dass sie eigentlich zu dem Schluss kommen, dass das Ziel dieser Anti-BDS-Kampagnen auch gar nicht BDS ist, sondern der Versuch, jede Diskussion darüber zu verhindern, wie aus Israel und Palästina ein binationaler Staat werden könnte. Also diese 122 Verteidiger des Rechts auf Widerstand, palästinensischen Widerstand, haben im Prinzip auch eine wichtige Linie überschritten, sich nämlich auch vom separatistischen, essentialistischen, arabisch-palästinensischen Nationalismus wegbewegt und eben auch in dieses unsichere Terrain, das dein Buch aufmacht, nämlich das Nachdenken über Form von gemeinsamer Staatlichkeit und geteilter Souveränität. Also es gibt eben schon palästinensische und arabische Intellektuelle, die das auch tun, zum Teil mit persönlichem eigenen Risiko. Ich gehe mal davon aus, das sind potenzielle Leser deines Buches. Wenn das nächstes Jahr auf Englisch erscheint, sicherlich. Auf Deutsch werden sich die meisten der Unterschreibenden dieser Resolution vermutlich schwer tun. Ich kann im Moment nur empfehlen, dieses Buch zu lesen und möchte heute Abend dir und allen, die bis jetzt ausgeharrt haben in dieser Diskussion, ausgeharrt sage ich ganz bewusst, weil mehr als 1,5 Stunden Zoom halte ich normalerweise nicht aus. Da sind wir jetzt schon deutlich drüber. Und es waren viele Leute, wir waren am Anfang fast 100 im Zoom und nochmal 50 auf YouTube. Es werden sicherlich nicht mehr ganz so viele jetzt sein. Es war ein voller Saal, den wir heute hatten, und der war ziemlich groß, weil die Teilnehmer kamen von Wien bis Zürich und Berlin und sonst wo hineingeschaltet. Vielen, vielen Dank, Omri Boehm. Wir werden uns sicherlich in Hohenems noch mal sehen, und wie gesagt, allen, die noch Kommentare, Fragen, und es sind viele, im Chat und in Frage und Antwort hineingestellt haben. Über alles können wir heute Abend nicht mehr reden, sonst sind wir noch um 12 Uhr nachts dran. Wir werden die Diskussion fortsetzen. Ich danke allen für die Diskussion, für die Fragen, für die Geduld. Und wie gesagt, es ist nie sehr einfach, das in Zoom zu tun. Wir hoffen sehr, dass wir doch irgendwann mal wieder in einem Raum sitzen können, der nicht nur virtuell existiert. Vielen Dank, und wir sehen uns hoffentlich alle bald wieder. Für dieses Jahr ist unser Programm damit auch zu Ende. Der Ausstellung Die letzten Europäer. Eine gute Nachricht gibt es trotzdem. Am Dienstag dürfen in Österreich Museen wieder öffnen. Und das heißt, wer die Ausstellung Die letzten Europäer gerne sehen möchte, kann das ab Dienstag tatsächlich wieder nicht nur virtuell, sondern auch physisch tun. Vielen, vielen Dank für die Teilnahme, fürs Kommen, und bleiben Sie uns gewogen. Ich wünsche schöne Weinuka-Tage, Chanukka-Tage und Weihnachtstage, und vor allem bleibt bitte alle gesund, passt auf euch auf, keine Dummheiten. Wir wollen gesund durch diesen Winter kommen. Danke.
Schönen Dank.
Schöne Grüße nach Berlin.